So, good afternoon if you are in New York City or Spring Hill, Florida. Good evening if you are in London. Good overnight if you are in other places in the world. Wishing that this broadcast find people living in peace and harmony. If you have to go to hell, the only person I would do it with is my guest today. But let me first tell you who I am. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. And when I refer to hell, I mean it only in the best sense because hell can be fun, especially if the devil is Zachary James, who is my guest today. Wonderful singer, actor, artist, public figure. We're going to get into all of that today, but I do want to tell you something, Zach. Today is February 16th of 2024. This is my 200th program on Fred Plotkin on Fridays. I began
Wow.
it April 24th of 2020 with Thomas Hampson. I've had many wonderful guests. I will continue to do so. But I wanted someone really very special for my 200th, and I picked you.
Oh, I'm so honored. Thank you.
So I'll explain in a moment why you're in London, but because you're an American. But I want to tell people that recently, in December, I believe, I'm a subscriber to many nonprofit theaters in New York City. I believe in supporting nonprofits in subscriptions as a model for art support. And one of them is called Second Stage, which is a very fine company. And I read nothing about the play that I was going to see. It simply, as a subscriber, I have faith that the company will do its best to present a good play or musical or whatever. So I only knew that the play was called Spain. And I walked in, and it was a matinee, and it was a largely student audience. And students react to everything they see, especially if they're not familiar with theater. And there were five characters. I was seated in the front row, and there was this one man sort of seated in the dark with a hat on, and he didn't say much. And they all spoke about him, and they kept saying, well, he likes opera, as if in almost a dismissive way. And I kept thinking, well, if this character likes opera, he must be very, very interesting. And this character was in the dark for much of the show, and then suddenly he appears and takes center stage and sings incredibly well. And I thought, well, that looks like Zachary James, but I've seen him a lot at the Met, and I've seen him in other opera companies, but he likes opera and he sings like a real opera singer. And then I sort of glanced at my program, and it was Zachary James. And there was a student talk back after, and I sort of hung in the shadows because I was not a student. But then I came up to you and I said, hi, I'm Fred Plotkin. You knew me. And this is how you've wound up on the show today. But we postponed it because you were about to head to London to star in the West End production of Hadestown as Hades. And you are
Yes.
now in early previews.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. All true. And yeah, it was so cool to see you at that matinee that day. You
Well,
just never
let's
know who's
talk a
going to be
little
there,
about
especially.
Spain. This
Yeah.
play. I don't remember the playwright. It was a mysterious play, because arguably it was about the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War, but it was also to me about today, um, obliquely about fascism, but really about the ability to persuade people to believe anything. How did
Hmm.
it wind up that Zachary James, the opera singer, wound up in this play?
Well, they had this really interesting idea for a character of a KGB agent named Carl who liked opera. And there's a lot of themes in the play of what the power of art and what art can do. And mixed in with that is the KGB hiring American artists to make propaganda to influence money to come from America for the Spanish Civil War, which Russia was involved in. And so they thought it would be interesting if Carl, the KGB agent, also had this bit of an artist in him. Maybe he wanted to be an opera singer, and now he's just an opera fan. It's something he does in his free time. But it was a really beautiful play to read. I got a call to do it, and it was in early development at that time. And they said, "Can you come in tomorrow and read this with some other prospective cast members?" And it was just a really lovely experience, and also to be at a table with actors of that caliber. I do a lot of musicals, I do a lot of operas. These were like play and TV and film actors, so it's slightly, different game with them as scene partners. You really have to be your best, and it was a great challenge for me to work with those actors, and I love working on new pieces. So to be attached to this new play and to work on it for 2 years and then finally present it in New York was a dream.
So you're seated, so the audience, if they've not seen you, cannot see that you are quite tall. You are, I
And
believe, 6'6", which is 2 meters, and
that's right.
very fit. But it presents a casting challenge, I would imagine, that goes beyond the fact that you have a beautiful voice and are a great actor, in that if you're being cast, they have to look at the other people who will be around you.
Right.
And we're going to get to this later, but I can picture certain roles immediately being ideal, like Wotan and the Commendatore and things like that. But others where it might be more of a challenge. Now, the
Right.
first time I saw you, I believe, I'd have to do my chronology, was in the musical The Addams Family as
Oh,
Lurch.
yes, yes.
And for people who know The Addams Family, Lurch is a rather quiet person. He's very tall,
Yes,
Urang, and he has a very deep voice. He's the butler of the Addams Family,
right.
and he doesn't say much, but he's very funny. How did you was that your first Broadway show? How did you wind up in that?
Well, it was actually my third Broadway show,
Uh-huh.
but my first major role on Broadway, and it's kind of a funny thing because I went to college for musical theater, but I was often urged to look into opera because of the quality of my voice, being a low voice male and having a darker, richer voice than kind of the trend of musical theater at that time. I was falling into classical musical theater and light opera and operetta, and so I was kind of exploring all avenues, but I did 3 Broadway shows and all of them had classical singing in them. My first Broadway show was a play called Coram Boy, and my
Oh,
primary
I saw
job was to sing Handel's Messiah.
it.
And
Hmm.
then I did South Pacific, which a lot of opera companies do now because it's very classical singing. And then the Adams Family, the role of Lurch, his song at the end of the show was actually inspired by Sparafucile in Rigoletto.
Wow.
Kind of really interesting in that sense that my opera, this opera thing that was bubbling underneath the surface of my theater career came through in all those experiences. But it's Broadway that got me to opera. In fact, in that the Addams Family was directed by Phelan McDermott, who directs a lot of Philip Glass's works, and so I was asked to audition for Philip Glass while I was doing the Addams Family, and I was cast as Abraham Lincoln in The Perfect American, which premiered at the Teatro Real in Madrid, and then English National Opera and
And that
Opera
was
Corps.
about Walt Disney, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that was kind of my professional operatic debut. So it's a very strange thing still to me to think, how did I get to Philip Glass from the Addams Family? But that's how it happened.
um, you put a lot on the table right there, so I'm going to
Yeah.
pick some of it up. But I actually saw you in Coram Boy, and
Oh, wow.
I know that I saw you in South Pacific, but I can't claim to have seen you because I was sort of looking at Paulo Shott and Kelly O'Hara.
Of course. Of
But
course.
no offense, but
Yeah.
I for that show I took my mother and we sat in the very first row
Oh, my God.
and
Yeah.
right on the aisle, and so that we had the performers right in front of us who were right in front of us, and the men
Yeah.
who were behind. There's
Yeah.
nothing like a dame. We're sort of behind, and I think you're one of those. But
Yeah.
just before we logged on, I took out an envelope and wrote out 8 names, and 5 of them are ostensibly opera singers. Paulo Schott, Regina Resnick, Renee
Okay.
Fleming, Ezio Pinza, Teresa Stratas are all opera singers who have done a lot in musical theater. Kelly O'Hara, Patti LuPone, and Audra McDonald are primarily Broadway artists who have done a lot in opera, especially Kelly O'Hara. Patti LuPone worked at LA Opera, Audra McDonald, I believe, in Houston and Los Angeles. And the point that it raises, and I know I could have put a lot more names, is I got to work a lot with Jesse Norman, who was a person of strong opinions. And one of her favorite expressions was, pigeonholes are for pigeons.
That's right.
In
Yeah.
other words, don't fence me in, don't define me, don't try to confine me to what you think I should be doing.
That's right.
But frankly, in my view, there are not that many performers in opera and in Broadway musical theater who can easily go back and forth.
Mm,
Angela Lansbury did a little bit. She did The Beggar's Opera. She did Sweeney Todd, which conceivably verges on opera. Um, there are quite a few, but I think primarily it's a different style and a different aesthetic. And the main thing, and you correct me if you think I'm wrong, is in opera, you don't use microphones, and in musical theater, you typically do.
yes. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and it is a big difference, and of course, there's exceptions in both genres where you don't use mics in some musicals and you use mics in some operas. But it definitely is. You know, when I went from doing a Broadway show 8 times a week to doing a filled glass opera, no microphone with an 80-piece orchestra, I definitely had to think about how I was going to sing it differently. It's just different, and it does require I want to say training, but it's also an awareness of how your body works as a singer, that it's opera singing is a full body experience. You are engaging your entire body. And you definitely can and should be doing that in musical theater as well, but it is quite different. And you can color things differently when you're using a microphone. You can get away with some really neat sotto voce, tricks and things. You can certainly whisper, but you find all those things in opera as well. But I think the biggest demand is flexibility and an open mind. And I think in musical theater, there is more of an allowance given for making what we might call like ugly sounds, but which allow the emotion to color the text more. And in opera, we do less of that. You try and get away with what you can, and it's exciting when it happens. But if you did an entire opera that way, it would not be servicing the music as it was written, typically.
I got news for you. When opera is good, being an audience member is a full body experience.
Heck yeah,
Yeah, it
sure,
really is.
yeah,
You
of
give
course,
yourself over. You expose your person to the sound.
yes, and it vibrates your
Obviously
whole
the
being.
story, but also the orchestra, but literally the sound that comes over you. There are certain artists, you're one of them. Another was Ava Martone. I shouldn't say was, but she's not singing that much anymore. Another was Birgit Nielsen,
Mm,
Hildegard Behrens. There are a few where you're just pinned back, and it's not about the volume. Karita Matil in her way. It's not about the volume, it's about something else
right.
that's like a laser beam.
Yeah.
Brandon Jovanovic, the tenor, has this, and
Mm.
it's not confined to one or another vocal category. There's just something, sometimes it's called ping,
Yeah,
but
sure.
yeah,
Yeah. It's
that
resonant,
just, yeah,
essentially.
resonance. It
Yeah.
particularly connects with an audience member if the audience member is paying attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can tell you, as someone who's worked in opera for many years, but also as an audience member, that it's a very different experience than going to a Broadway show.
Oh, yeah.
I am old enough and I began going to Broadway shows young enough that I heard Ethel Merman, Carol Channing, Georgia Brown, Zero Mostel, Joel Gray, a lot of these people unmiked.
Wow.
And they
Wow.
were doing shows 8 days a week. Miking came sort of around 1970 or a little later.
Yeah.
Um, and even then, I heard Elaine Stritch before microphones.
Wow.
I heard a lot of these people, and they knew how to sing.
Sure.
And that's why I frankly go to less Broadway than I used to, because we have both the singers and the orchestra mic'd. and
Hmm.
amplified, and it's called sound mixing or sound adjustment or whatever. I hate it
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's all very homogenized.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas in an opera house with a good acoustic like the Met or Covent Garden or a number of others, um, you can pick out the sound more as the composer intended it, and then
Right.
as understood and performed by the conductor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I go to both, and I go to everything. I go to dance, I go to orchestra, I go to plays, I go to musicals, I go to the operas. But it is a different acoustic experience at the opera, certainly. It also, I think, because of the way we experience musicals and the way we experience movies in the cinema, which is kind of a very similar acoustic experience to a musical now on Broadway. It takes me a second for my ear to adjust to an acoustic experience to just say, ah, this is the opera. We have to listen harder. But then something switches and that all of the resonance combines and it's like uh, washing over you in a way that it doesn't when it's non-acoustic. So I, yeah, it's complex. I would have loved to have heard Ethel Merman on Broadway without a mic. That I speak about her exactly all the time when we talk about this.
Well,
So,
then I'll tell you a story. When I worked at the Met, I lived in a building on West 57th Street called the Sheffield.
uh,
And it was sort of a performers and performing arts dorm of 51 stories, in
wow,
that just about everyone who lived there worked in some way in the arts, either as management. We had Jojo Starbuck, the ice skater. We had
wow,
many chorus boys and chorus girls. We had Rockettes. We had opera singers.
hmm,
We had Stephen Van Zandt, little Stephen of the Bruce Springsteen,
wow,
was my down the hall neighbor. Theodore Hanslow, a mezzo at the Met, lived down the hall from me.
of
Ken
course,
Hicks, a wonderful tenor, lived a few floors down. Rita Patinay and Francesca Patinay and Giuseppe Patinay lived upstairs.
yeah,
And we all lived in this very large building, which at the time was the tallest residential building in New York City. And at
wow,
the top floor were two apartments. They were sort of penthouses. And in one of them lived Gregory Peck, and in the other one lived Ethel Merman.
wow, wow,
And Ethel Merman was obviously very famous, and she was very nice, but she was no nonsense. But she was very nice, and she understood that in this building, it was kind of like being in a 1930s movie. That,
hmm,
oh, Miss Berman, we just love you last night. Thank you, honey. I gotta go. Mama's gotta go. And in the
yeah.
loudest of loud voices.
Wow,
And unfortunately, she late in life developed a brain tumor and could not hear how loud she was.
wow,
And poor Gregory Peck, her next door neighbor and a real gentleman, had to deal with the fact that she would be screaming at the top of her lungs because she couldn't hear anymore. It was very
wow,
sad.
with all the
But
presidents.
nonetheless, everyone knew Miss Berman and Mr. Peck,
Yeah,
and they were very nice, and they were kind of like our king and queen up in the sky, like
oh,
Wotan and Fricka.
of course, of course. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a story to tell, that building.
Yeah.
Because it was a story of 1980s performing arts New York.
Sounds like a
And what
dream.
I loved about it was that all of us in our different art forms intermingled. So you
Mm,
could have Bruce Springsteen's right-hand man on the same floor as mezzo-soprano Theodora Hanslow, on the
yeah,
same floor as Fred Plotkin, performance manager of the Met, and that every floor had versions of these.
right.
And it's a quite wonderful story to be told that
Mm,
we don't quite replicate in the same way anymore because of New York real estate values and how
right.
people lived. But it was kind of a golden time, and we
Yeah.
all went to each other's shows, and we all would turn out for rehearsal for the Rockettes at the beginning of the run in Radio City. And
Fabulous.
but anyway, that's Ethel Merman.
Oh,
But
wow.
I want to get back to a role that we didn't quite talk about yet with you. I will say, in full disclosure, I absolutely adore Fella McDermott. I
Hmm.
just think he's a genius, and I love his work.
Agreed.
He's done opera, he's done musical theater. I just think he knows it. I've told him. I just think he's terrific. So I'm very happy that he discovered you.
Yeah,
But
kind of.
I
Yeah.
think most people would say that in New York, at least, and also London, um, their first encounter with you might have been in his production of Philip Glass's Akhenaten.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, Talk about the role. I mean, it brings in your physicality, your
yeah,
height, your
yes,
very broad shoulders, and so on. It's as if
yeah.
you were, well, here's the question. Were you made for the role, or was the role tailored to you?
I think both in a weird way. I don't know. It really came out of nowhere and was also cosmic. It found me, the role, as you know, is entirely spoken, but over an orchestra, scored out, and you have to be a pretty good musician to count while speaking over an enormous orchestra to 5,000 people and, hit these cues. It's very complex. It's very, very stressful and an enormous amount of responsibility. Thankfully, I've been doing it for so long, off and on for, I guess, 8 years now, that it's in my bones, and I never.
And the character's Amenhotep the Third.
I'm in Hotep the Third. It's a 1983 Philip Glass opera. Originally, the role was off stage, spoken into a microphone. So it really is the major change in Phelim's production is that it's an onstage role, and he makes this role Akhenaten's father. So there's a personal relationship to everyone on stage, and that allows the humanity to bubble up into these characters. That there's a family life. It's like everyone can identify with them more when they see this family unit, and everyone knows a parent-child relationship and the complexities of that. So but I have to say, the funny story about it is that it wasn't cast. They didn't cast the role. And they were 2 weeks out from rehearsal for the first production in London at English National Opera in 2016. And I get this message from Phelim on Facebook saying, "Hey, what are you doing? Can you come to London next week?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And then I walk in, I'm handed this massive score, and I think it's like 2,000 words of soliloquies, and I'm thrown into this rehearsal process, and everyone else knew they were cast years in advance, and here I am,
Mm-hmm.
sort of, the thing that glues the show together. I rarely leave stage. It's, as you said, incredibly physically demanding and vocally demanding, but yeah, I was really thrown into the lion pit there, and we created it together in a beautiful collaborative way. But really, he sort of had an idea of what he wanted. I had no idea what it was. And because of our trust and our history of collaboration, working on The Perfect American and working on The Addams Family, we created something very special that we're both very proud of. It's really the greatest honor of my career, really, is that production. You look back and you see things that changed your life as a performer, and that's definitely, it's a huge one for me. It's a turning point for me, and I had never been given such responsibility on stage. And when I realized the weight of it, what was on my shoulders, and that I was actually pulling it off, when I finally memorized it and we staged it and everything, and we were about to open for the first time, I was just kind of blown away by Phelim's trust in me. And yeah, I'm forever grateful to him. He really did discover me in a weird way. Like, I had been on Broadway for years, but he cast me in Addams Family, and then he cast me in these Philip Glass operas, and it kind of all points back to him.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting.
Um, Trying to think what to ask next about this production. I want to say first to listeners that it's available on H. It was seen in HD from the Metropolitan Opera, and
Yes,
it's available as a video, and it's a wonderful thing to watch. Do not default say, "Ooh, Philip Glass, two notes repeated." It's not
no,
any of that. It's gorgeous,
yeah,
and
it's
it's really
awesome.
something else.
Yeah.
The man who played Akhenaten, the title character, is
Hmm.
Anthony Roth Costanzo, who is a
Yes,
friend of mine. He was on the show a couple of years ago, and I've known him since he really was just starting out. He
of
is a
course.
phenomenon in opera because he's a countertenor who is a major star, can carry a production. He's artistically bold. He's highly intelligent. He teaches
Yeah.
at Princeton. And physically, he is strong but small.
Diminutive, yes.
diminutive,
I could hold him
and
over my head.
very athletic. But part of the point of that was, as I don't want to give too much away about the opera, but as his character progresses and let's say weakens physically,
Yeah,
um, you as his perhaps his father, I don't want to give this away,
sure.
um, begin to embrace him more and carry him and lift him and
Yeah,
which you could obviously do because you're tall and strong and have big shoulders and he's diminutive.
yeah,
But what was very beautiful and tender in those scenes was that he went from being a boy king to a frail infant in your big
yeah,
arms.
exactly.
And talk about the evolution of the characterization of that, because it was, you know, people say opera is not emotional, opera is not tender, they're crazy. But it was really some of the most beautiful acting
Hmm.
and emotional intimacy I've seen on the opera stage of a
Wow.
father and a son.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's what Phelim set out to do, I have to say. He said, I want to make this an emotional experience. I want to make a Philip Glass opera emotional because as we know, people have different reactions to it, but I would say it's not often emotional. Sometimes it can put you in a trance, but
Oh
it's
yeah.
not necessarily, you're not weeping, you're not laughing, you're not, so but he had this image for the particular scene you're talking about of the pietà of Mary holding Jesus, and it was interesting because Phelim rarely has a concrete image of like, I want this. He's often more interested in working with another artist to harvest something together. But in this moment, he said, I want this. And we played with it, and it instantly was just so powerful. And to see, as you said, to see him weaken into an infant in my arms, and that's kind of what I was talking about with the humanity in it, and having relationships that we can relate to, a parent-child relationship, and also what one of the saddest things there is a parent that loses their child.
Yeah.
The parent's supposed to go first, and it's horrific, and of course my character is the show opens with my funeral, so he's
Hmm.
also gone, but we're playing with time and space in a way that's not doesn't really matter, and these are like gods, they transcend past reality. So yeah, but it was a really beautiful, tender thing. And also Anthony and I didn't know each other at that point, and we had to
Mm.
develop this bond and this trust that really has carried us forward, because we are the two artists from that original production who've remained with it the entire time. We've done it so many times now, and it's um yeah, it's a very, very special thing. He and I, we don't need to speak anymore. We're just connected. And the opera lives in his bones the same way that it lives in mine. It's just like, this ritual, and this is what we do, and it just comes out of your body. It's not like anything else. It's very interesting.
Um, the opera, the production, I should say, not the opera, also involves a great deal of acrobatics and juggling and
Yes.
things that you have to do repetitively with your hands.
I do. Yeah, I have to juggle, and it's very stressful, but I've learned a lot from juggling. I never juggled before this production, and it's really a kind of a deep spiritual practice, because you have to be fully present and you have to be breathing, and or your balls drop. So it's
Meaning the ones that you're juggling.
yes, both, but
I know
it's
you're a bass.
yeah, yeah. But
um,
it's taught me a lot about being that show in general has taught me a lot about performing, and
mhm.
the spiritual practice of performing, and mostly what it is to be present, fully present on stage.
um, the juggling, I happen to love juggling. I'm not good at
Yeah,
it, but it's transfixing. I love circus as a general phenomenon. I love those old arts in a
yeah,
way,
yeah.
and because they're the most human, because
Hmm.
they don't have the intercession, the interference of technology. They're about human capacity.
Yes.
And one really, as an audience member, also has to focus on what the jugglers are doing, not
Yes.
because he may drop a ball or whatever he's juggling, flames or whatever, um, but just because you really want them to succeed.
Yes. Yes.
And if
Yeah.
they fail, you don't say, "Oh, he dropped the ball," but you say, "Okay, he'll do better next time."
Yeah. And isn't that the metaphor for the show, basically? Is like you
Yeah,
want not to succeed, but he's failing his society that he runs. And yeah, it's like, okay, this society failed. We'll do better next time. Right.
yeah.
It's very interesting. It really makes it a visceral experience.
But
And
that's Wagner. That's the ring cycle. This
yeah,
society failed. We'll do it better next time.
exactly. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'll get to the ring in a moment because obviously it screams out for attention,
Uh,
um, as Wagner did all the time. But the first, I think, only opera production I ever worked on with acrobatics was back in December of 1984. It was Handel's Rinaldo at the Met,
oh wow.
and it was the first Handel opera to be done at the Met. It was a gift from
Ever?
the Canadian. Yeah,
Oh my
yeah.
God.
It was a gift from, I believe it was Ottawa, not Toronto, but I could be wrong, from the Canadian government for the Met Centennial because the Met was opened in 1883.
Yeah.
So in the 83-84 season came this Ronaldo with
Wow.
Marilyn Horne as Ronaldo,
God.
with Samuel Ramey and Carol Vaness making their Met debuts, with a wonderful Benita Valente. It was just a stunning cast.
Oh,
And the director Mario Bernardi, I think, an Italian Canadian, introduced acrobatics because
wow.
the vocal fireworks of both Horn and Ramey called out for that. And
Yeah.
I thought, okay, it's going to be distracting because you
Hmm.
basically had these very fit guys from a gym in the South Bronx who didn't know anything about opera, but were very buff and would come out and do these acrobatic leaps. And
Yeah.
at first, they were just doing their acrobatics.
Yeah.
And then we said to them, listen to the music, because what you have to do are acrobatics to not what's in the orchestra, but what Miss Horn is singing or what Mr.
Sure.
Ramey is singing.
Sure.
Um, and they really got into it.
Hmm.
And they were converted from being, wonderful athletes who know nothing about opera to, wow, I love this music. They didn't say
Sure.
music, they used a different word.
Uh-huh.
And they started becoming opera goers and they started
Wow.
being used in other productions, as sort of muscle men like in Turandot or Il Trovatore.
Sure.
But they became sort of part of the DNA of the Met, these guys.
Wow.
Um, and the first juggling was actually not at the Met, was in a production I was involved in Minnesota of the Barber of Seville, where they decided that the barber, who was, everybody wanted him everywhere, had a lot to juggle. So he juggled combs and brushes
Oh my God.
and bottles of hairspray and so on. And the guy did it pretty well, but it was
Wow.
very distracting. And he said, I'm not juggling scissors because I
No.
can't do that. But this kind of theater, opera is theater too. It's called the
Absolutely.
teatro lirico.
Yeah.
Um, can call for that as long as it's in the music, I believe.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
And
Yeah.
therefore, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean that's what's brilliant about Akhenaten, the choreography of the juggling by Sean Gandini. It is incredibly mathematic and musical and matches. He's even matching the syncopation, the 3 against 2 of Philip Glass. It's very complex and impressive, and just kind of mind-boggling when you realize you're like, oh my God, that pattern they're doing is the cellos against the piccolos. It's like, wow, incredible.
But audience members don't need to know that, or they don't know that.
No,
Yeah.
no, they don't. But we have our Akhenaten has a cult following. We
Yeah.
have people who have come to every performance. We have people who travel the world to see us if we're in London or LA or wherever we're going next. So and that's really an incredibly beautiful experience.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, we have people who notice different things and
Yeah.
they tell us all about it afterwards.
Another opera I want to talk to you about, Breaking the Waves.
Yeah,
Um, that to me is one of the greatest contemporary operas.
I agree.
It was extraordinary. I saw it in Philadelphia,
Mhm.
and then in other places. And talk about this opera. It's based on a film. You talk about it. It's a remarkable
Yeah.
opera.
Yeah, so it's based on a Lars von Trier film, who, of course, wrote and directed Dancer in the Dark. And I think that's his most famous film. But also, um, I believe he did Melancholia also.
Hmm.
Yeah, so he's pretty prolific, and all of his work is very dark. The film
Yes.
of Breaking the Waves is incredibly depressing. What Missy Mazzoli and Royce Vavrick did was I guess I'm talking about humanity a lot in this interview, but they brought out the humanity in this incredibly dark story by doing what opera does best, musicalizing the emotions, things that we feel that only music can express. And so it was a really stunning experience to work on that piece. It's a new work that I was in development for 2 years in Philadelphia. We would meet every 6 months for about a week and workshop a new section of the opera. And it was just a beautiful experience to be in that.
And what was your role?
I was Terry, the best friend of Jan, and another opera where I carry the seemingly dead person off stage. So that's my burden in life as a tall man. I carry the person who's died. So, but yeah, it was a really cool experience and such great artists: Kira Duffy, John Moore, Eve Gigliotti. It was just a great experience, and um, it was Opera Philadelphia is in a bit of figuring themselves out right now, but I think that moment in history was Opera Philadelphia's shining triumph
Yeah.
and a gift to the world of contemporary opera. And it
They
felt,
created a festival called O, like opera,
yes, yes,
um, for different years, like O 19, O 20, but then there was the pandemic.
yeah,
Um, and they were held usually in September.
yep,
I went to all of them
yeah,
because this was really where the cutting edge of opera was.
exactly,
And I
exactly.
think the pandemic threw them a real curve because they couldn't, it's a wonderfully historic company and they perform in wonderful venues, including the Academy of Music, which is
Oh,
from the 1850s, but there are many theaters they use.
yeah,
And your show was in a smaller theater in the
yeah,
Perelman, I think. Yeah.
yes, that's right.
And they did this incredibly well. David Devan, who was a guest on the show, um, was a genius at making this kind of thing happen.
Yep.
And I certainly hope that they bounce back from the challenges that the pandemic
Yeah,
the pandemic imposed problems on all arts companies, but
yep.
Philadelphia, because it centered so much on its festival
Yeah,
in a different way from companies that perform throughout the year.
yeah. And it became a destination for opera, and I think the patron base traveled a lot to see this festival. And I think, yeah, people kind of stopped traveling, and yeah, it's tough. But I was actually living in Philadelphia for a few years after I did Breaking the Waves because I fell in love with it, and I ended up doing Love for Three Oranges in one of their festivals.
Which
And
I saw. Yep.
yeah, yeah, I
Yep.
was a giant hen lady.
um, let's
Yeah,
talk more about Breaking the Waves, just
yeah,
because it was a phenomenal film
yes.
uh, that I loved. I'm suddenly forgetting her name, the wonderful British actress who starred in
Oh
Angela's
God,
Ashes,
Rachel.
played, yeah, we'll think of her name. But she was in the film, and Kira Duffy, to me, gave the performance of the year
Yeah,
in that opera. She was extraordinary.
yes.
Without giving too much away, it's a story. It's set on an oil rig,
Yep.
sort of Scotland, Norway, that area where there's a lot of oil. And she's a shy girl, let's say, and then she falls in love with a man, and he has a horrible injury, but she is committed to caring for him.
Yes.
And so you have one character who is um, basically incapacitated for most of the opera. You have the other character who has to react to all of that, and it's a huge emotional and vocal range. And
Mhm.
then there's your character who is the broad shoulders in effect,
Yeah.
um, but is anchors the opera in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I had all the funny material that cut through the tension.
Yeah.
Uh, the laugh lines, which is always fun. But yeah, it was a terrific piece, and it's had a nice life since, and I think it will
Yeah.
continue to. But yeah, it was really stunning. And Keira Duffy, unforgettable performance, and
Hmm.
unforgettable to be in that room with her. It was quite beautiful, and the orchestration also, as a character itself, was it was kind of that beautiful cinematic soundscape that tells you what to feel without um, being overly manipulative, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. Yeah.
Now, I made myself a little list of some of the roles you've done,
Yeah.
and there's a through line of obviously being a bass, but also of your physicality. But
Okay.
they're interesting to me for the range, but also because a lot of them are very vivid dramatically.
Yes.
Some of them are short, like the Commendatore.
Uh-huh.
One of my favorite roles that you did is Osmin in
Yeah.
Die Entführung aus dem Serail, which is a comedy.
Yes.
And we don't see it enough. My father, who really knew his music, he was a musician, that was his favorite Mozart opera.
Hmm.
He loved the music, he loved the comedy.
It's phenomenal. It's virtuosic, every
Yeah,
role. Yeah.
yeah.
Phenomenal. Yeah, that's a special one because it was a role I wanted to play. I got a call from my agent saying, "Hey, do you want to play Osmin?" And I said, "Yes, I've been waiting to." And she said, "Great, the performance is on Friday. Do you think you can learn it?" And it was a Sunday. And I was like, "Oh God!" And I called my voice teacher, and she said, "Come over right now." I spent 2 days with my voice teacher. Flew on Tuesday and opened on Friday.
But
And
what does this say about the arts that, 2 weeks ahead of doing Akhmenhotep III,
you
five
know,
days ahead of doing
yeah.
Osmin? I mean, but
I
other
don't
things
know.
you say you were in workshop for years.
Yeah.
Explain that to audience members who don't know that there's not a consistency about how people get their roles.
No, there's not. It's really like they say, timing meets preparation, or I don't know. It learning Osmin in 2 days might have taken some years off my life, but I also learned
Was
what
it German or English?
German.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, but I learned what I was made of, and it's kind of like, wow, I can do that. My brain is capable of that. My body's capable of that. Um, but then I processed it, and it was like, you know what, though, because the previous year I had received a grant from the Kurt Weill Foundation, who I was pretty involved with and remain so. And I received a professional development grant, which I used to go to Germany and do language school in Berlin. And I just thought, like, wow, had I not done that a year ago, I would not have been able to learn this role in 2 days. But because I could handle the German, I was. And you kind of just see these little miracles that happen along the way that add up to being prepared for these last minute opportunities. And that was one of them. But yeah, there really is a grand inconsistency in that you can be hired 3 years in advance and hold your schedule, or you can be called the day before. And we get a lot of those calls because people get sick, or people get other opportunities. And it's I've said no to a lot of those calls, and I've said yes to the ones that I knew I could pull off and not embarrass myself, but more so I could be of service to the piece.
Mhm.
And you have to get out of the way of your own ego in those situations and just buckle down and have faith. And it's hard. It's really hard, but you also have to ask for what you need and just say, today I need to do this scene 20 times,
Yeah.
whatever. But yeah, in the cases where I've had to do that, I've been very supported, and for that I'm grateful. And the ones I've said no to, I had no regrets about saying no, because it's stressful. Um,
Hmm.
but but yeah, it's preferable to have the preparation time and the years in advance. But then, of course, we learn that anything can happen, and there can be a pandemic, and it all gets canceled anyway. So
Sure.
yeah,
I know that you were preparing Banquo in Macbeth,
yes, I
and
was.
that was pandemic, if that's a word.
Yeah, lots
Yeah.
of lots of things canceled. Yeah, Banquo, and oh God, I don't even remember everything. Also, a lot of things got shuffled around where it was like I was scheduled to do a Rusalka, and then it was canceled but replaced with the Pirates of Penzance, and they asked me to do that instead. Stuff like that. where you just
You
saw,
were the Pirate King?
yeah, several times now.
That's natural casting.
Yeah, I love the Pirate King. He's a lot of fun. But it was interesting to see coming back from the pandemic how programming shifted to really hone in on surefire bets with audience. And, I understand replacing a Rusalka with the Pirates of Penzance in Cincinnati when you have an enormous theater and people want to laugh. So,
Yeah. That's a
yeah.
lovely opera company, Cincinnati.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, really.
I should say in full disclosure, I've done a lot of work there and I have great respect for that company and
yeah.
we're friends for decades.
Uh,
And they have the advantage of Grater's ice cream, which may be America's greatest
yes,
brand of ice cream.
yes.
Is big inducement. You land at the airport and you get your first scoop of Grater's even before coming into the city.
Uh, yeah, I had a terrific time,
Yeah.
honestly. And I had never been to Cincinnati, and I didn't realize its proximity to Kentucky, and it's really like the northern boundary of Appalachia, which has a soft place in my heart, having grown up camping in the Smoky Mountains and such as a kid.
Hmm.
But I had a great time.
And for people who know the opera Margaret Garner that they premiered there with Detroit
Yeah.
and Philadelphia, um, the Ohio River separates Kentucky from Ohio.
Sorry, one second, bro.
Yes.
Sorry, where'd you go?
Oh, sorry, we closed 5 minutes ago.
You did.
Well, yes, and I'm closing the whole building.
Okay, so I have to leave.
Yes.
Okay. They're closing the building.
Aha. Okay. So what we're going to do, we love Cincinnati, but we're going to talk about Hadestown, which you're just in previews now for. How
Yeah.
did you get the role? And you're just in the early stages of doing it. Talk about doing Hadestown in London.
Yeah, I think they're kicking me out though. I think we have a problem
I
here.
mean, you have 3 minutes.
Uh, yes,
Tell
yes.
us 3 minutes of Hadestown, and then off to hell we go.
Okay. So Hadestown, I actually did Sweeney Todd in Opera Omaha, and the choreographer there asked me to audition for Hadestown because he was the choreographer of the Broadway production. And it's been 2 years since then, but this finally came along to premiere Hadestown in the West End in London, which is an absolute dream. It's the West End debut of the show and a phenomenal cast. I'm the only American, and we're all using native accents, our own dialects. So it's really quite interesting to be an American Hades with an Irish Orpheus and an entirely British cast and a Trinidadian, Hermes, and it's really really cool.
Congratulations on all the good work you've done. Next time you and I get to sit down, I want to talk to you about your future as a Wagnerian.
Yes, please. I'm ready.
Okay. Wotan, the Giants, obviously, but it just seems to be there, and I'm ready to hear you.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. Thanks, Zach James. Great to see you.
Thank you,
Enjoy your
Fred.
time in London.
All right.